Welcome to the #1 podcast covering Michigan State basketball. The Final Four is not on the schedule. Join Rod and me, Eric, as we dive deep into the Spartans to get you prepared for every game. Subscribe today for in-depth recruiting updates and fantastic interviews with today's important college basketball personalities like Robbie Hummel.
Thanks for having me. I have listened to your guys' podcast numerous times on drives throughout any Midwestern Big Ten city. So I am big fans of your guys' work.
Jay Billis.
And next time, hey, if anybody in Michigan wants a December tea time, call me. You wimps won't show up, but I'll be there. I'll be there and play in the cold. And Izzo will be in front of the fire with hot chocolate.
Coaches Thomas Kelly.
No problem. Glad to be back, man. Glad to be back.
Mike Garland.
Just can't sit there and trade twos for threes. You can't do it. You're gonna lose. Coming down the stretch, you're gonna lose.
And more. You won't find better coverage of Spartan hoops than you will get here. For both the casual and hardcore fan, come along as we take you for a green and white ride. Hey everybody, it's Eric alongside Rod to talk about MSU's final exhibition game of the season. But the first one, that's at the Breslin Center, which is Ferris State. I don't know about you, but I, for one, am excited to head back to East Lansing and put an ice cream sandwich in my hand and watch some hoops. At some point, it just kind of gets a little old talking about the team, so it's definitely time to watch them play and have a little fun. Of course, it isn't a real game, but probably won't feel a lot different, I don't think, than the season opener on Monday the 4th, except maybe a few different players will play, like Jesse McCullough, if he might redshirt. And I think as far as the challenge, it should be pretty similar because Ferris State's pretty good, pretty solid D2 team. And just as Ferris State is GLIAC powerhouse, I think we mentioned that when we were talking about Northern Michigan a couple weeks ago, that Northern Michigan happened to win the GLIAC last year, but it's been pretty much dominated by Ferris State, who Michigan State has played a number of times in the exhibition season, along with Grand Valley.
I think this is the fourth time they played Ferris since Andy Bronkema has become the head coach.
Right. And I think they played him, 3 years ago, maybe? Because they had, I can't remember his name, but he was on the team, and then this year before, and then he transferred to Michigan State and blew out his ACL that first, and I, for life, make
Michael Peterson. Yeah.
Right, yeah. So under Andy Bronkema, as you mentioned, the Ferris coach, he has a 73% overall winning percentage, 70% of GLIAC games in his 11-year career. He's won a title in 2018 and has been to the NCAA tournament 7 times and would have been 8, but of course, just like everyone else, COVID messed things up. 4 regular season GLIAC titles, and they were the runner-up last year to, as we mentioned, Northern Michigan, but ended up winning the conference tournament because they beat Northern Michigan in the tournament game, made to the Elite 8. And so I think if there's anything surprising about Andy Bronkema is that he's in Big Rapids still because he's had a lot of success there.
Yeah, he's won 20 games or more in 9 out of 11 seasons. As you mentioned, would have been 8 tournament appearances, 4 GLIAC regular season titles. I think it might be more than that in terms of the tournament titles. And then he's got a national championship on his resume, and they were in the Elite 8 last year. He has been definitely mentioned for and interviewed for, I'm pretty sure, the U of D job.
I would have guessed that one, yeah.
And I'm pretty sure the Western Michigan job. So I think, and don't quote me on that, but I think he's lost out to a couple of MSU assistants for Division I jobs in state. But I got to say, when you look at his track record and the fact that he's young, that if you get him, you're getting a guy, I believe he's maybe in his mid-40s at the oldest, so might even be early 40s. But if you get a guy like him, I think you're really giving yourself a shot to hitch your wagon to a guy who's going to elevate your program very quickly. I mean, I think about a guy like Indiana State.
Schertz,
Indiana
right?
State's head coach last year, Josh Schertz, who was there a couple of years and is now at St. Louis. So he's gone from D2 to the Missouri Valley to the A10.
Mm-hmm. In short order.
And it won't surprise, in very quick succession, and it won't surprise me if you see him go up another level. Or I think about Indiana's football coach in a different sport, but the same general idea. Or if you want to take it to keep it with basketball, you think about guys like John Beilein or Bo Ryan, who had comparable success to what Bronkema has done, and then got their opportunities eventually to run a D1 program and moved up the ladder to where they were running Big Ten programs that were capable of competing in national title games. And I'm not saying that Andy Bronkema, that it's a given that he ever gets to those heights, because that's a hard thing to do. But I look at what Ferris State has done, and I've got to think, if you're running a Horizon League or a Summit League or a MAC program, I get it. Expecting a Big Ten program to go and hire a guy from D2 is likely a bridge too far. It would take an incredible amount of guts to do that. But if you're talking about those three conferences, or even extend it to like the Missouri Valley, why would you not? If you're in a place where you've lost a coach, and most of those are not because a coach left to take another job. Most of the time, it's a firing. You've got a vacancy because your program wasn't good enough.
Right.
Why would you not? I mean, the guy's been doing this year in, year out for a little over a decade now. So, and look, I will not pretend to know all the ins and outs. It could be that he is waiting, that he's selective, and he's waiting for exactly the right opportunity. And maybe there have been jobs that were there for the taking, and he opted not to take them. That happens. I mean, Dane Fife did that when he was on Tom Izzo's staff.
Right.
He had the Duquesne job if he wanted it. That was an A-10 job. I mean, that's a really, it wouldn't have been his first job because he'd obviously been a head coach before coming to MSU. But for your first, a job coming out of the Big Ten, coming back out into a head coaching job, an A-10 job, even a bad one, is a pretty good place to start on the ladder. He opted not to take it. So there are times where guys are selective, but man, it really does make me wonder. And I've got to think that it's going to happen in the near future. Because it does seem clear, because he's interviewed for those jobs we mentioned. It seems clear that he wants to be a D1 coach. I don't think it's that he's decided, well, I'm just fine being the big man in Big Rapids, and I have no pretension to moving on anywhere else. I mean, it seems to me likely that he wants to challenge himself by moving up the ladder. And I got to think somebody's going to pull the trigger. The guy's just had way too much success to not get that kind of opportunity.
Yeah. Maybe he's really bad at interviews. Like when they ask him what kind of animal he'd be, he doesn't get the answer.
I kind of doubt, just watching him a little bit. I just watched in prep for this. I just watched an interview that he did talking about his team, and I'm going to guess he interviews pretty well based on that.
What is your biggest weakness? Oh, I'm all strengths. That's my problem. I'm too good.
Right. Yeah. I'm not thinking that's it. What I'm thinking it is, if I had to guess, is what usually happens in these kind of situations. It can be challenging for a school to explain to their fan base why they are hiring a guy from a lower level of college basketball. And it's a lot easier to win the press conference if you could say, well, I hired this guy who was an assistant on Coach X's staff at a high major school, right?
Yep.
But the problem with that is for starters, a guy at a D2 coming from the D2 level has already run their own program.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And if they're going to a place like, God knows, I don't want to talk Dwayne Stevens or Mark Montgomery out of a job. Those guys deserve those opportunities, no question. But let's just say, Central Michigan, to pick a scumbag school that allows players for coaches, quote unquote, staff members from the University of Michigan to put themselves in a disguise that wouldn't pass muster in a Pink Panther movie on their sideline. Just to pick a scumbag school like that, you're running a program at a place where it's hard to recruit to. because it's hard to recruit to any of those schools.
Right.
Because the fact of the matter is very, very few of the players you're recruiting dreamed of playing at that school. They all dreamed of playing. You know what I mean? I mean, that's not a knock. It's just reality. And so wouldn't you think, well, a guy who's actually run a program of that ilk and had a lot of success at it, even if it's at a little lower level than we're at, might know some things that a guy who's never run a program himself doesn't know. It's like a lot of other things in life, but I think that oftentimes it seems to me that athletic directors get caught up in what you could call credentialism. The same as in other professions, right?
Sure.
We automatically assume and ascribe expertise to someone with a PhD beside their name, despite the fact that they might be a moron, which is possible to have both of those things coexist, right?
Yeah. 100%.
So I think it's similar. I think it's similar to that, and it explains at least some of why these guys that have so much. And again, Bronkema's not. Hey, he's had a good 3-year run. It's a decade.
Yeah. Right.
A decade plus. Come on.
It's not like just getting one player who carries you for a little bit or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, long story short, I'm a little bit surprised that he's still there, but I can't believe that he's going to be there that much longer.
Yeah.
Somebody smart is going to snap him up and give him a shot to do it at the D1 level. I have to believe that's true.
Yeah, and I think this is a important thing. Kind of, we were talking about this exhibition game, but the expectation that someone who's an administrator, like an athletic director, has knowledge about athletics, they may not. That's right. They may be brought in for their skills with accounting. The fact that they're good, moving money around and managing department personnel, fundraising.
Yes,
there are all kinds of other skills that come to that, and that are important as an athletic director, but picking the right person to coach, a volleyball team or something like that may not be something they're good at or in their purview. Yeah. And so that's why when you get people who understand sports and it can do the other things, it's unique. I mean, I think, Michigan State right now, Adam Haller, is a guy who has been in athletics his whole life, and he's got the administrative experience. I think it's a real benefit to have what he's got. And you definitely see all kinds of athletic directors that struggle with these hires for the same reasons you mentioned. They're looking to win press conferences, or they're not recognizing these other things, or they think, I'm only here 5 years anyway, or 10 years, or I'm best friends of the president. Who knows, right? There's all a million reasons.
Well, it's the standard issue kind of problem with these kind of situations in almost any walk of life, where it reminds me of, it's a little bit of an analogy. There's this old line in the entertainment business, in the movie business, that's attributed to a very successful writer named William Goldman, who said there are only two things that are true in Hollywood. Everybody knows everybody, and nobody knows anything. And the latter is particularly important, because what that meant was, try as they might, nobody has actually figured out what's likely to make a film, and you can translate this to anything else.
Sure.
A book, a movie, music, a product that you're selling. Nobody's ever truly figured out the formula to what makes a hit. So in that kind of environment, because nobody knows, the easy thing to do is to take the conventional easy path.
Right.
Because at least you won't be criticized for doing that. Mm-hmm. Whereas you will be criticized for getting, I hate to use cliches, but for thinking outside of the box.
Right.
Doing the thing that's not expected, taking the road less traveled, all of that, and taking a risk. Because you definitely will get criticized for that.
Right.
And you might lose your job.
Yep.
If it fails miserably, so I think in a lot of these cases, you just have administrators that are scared. They're scared to do something that won't be immediately received positively by the press, by the fan bases, et cetera.
Or alumni, in this case, small schools.
Well, that's what I mean, the fan base.
Right,
yeah. And and therefore, and they don't want to take that criticism. So, well, I'll hire an assistant from program X, and people will assume that means I'm getting a mini me of their former boss. When that's rarely the case. I mean, it sometimes it works, but not usually. So I don't know. Anyway, bottom line is I've got to think somebody's going to be smart enough to give the guy a chance, because if you have the kind of success that he's had at that level, I've got to believe he's got a decent shot at the very least of replicating it at the mid-major level.
Yeah.
In D1. Because there's not as many differences between a Ferris State and a Central Michigan as people might think.
No,
there really aren't.
Yeah, I wouldn't think so. Yeah, and so you're looking for someone really good. The important thing is make sure you're looking the right direction. And so if you need gutter work done, the Brothers of Just Do Gutters are the guys you want to go to. They're the experts. They're not sexy, not glamorous, but they will get the job done. Whether it's a house, whether it's your business, they can replace, repair, or clean out your gutters. They can put leaf guards on. They can put those things to melt the ice, and so you don't have ice dams build up in your gutters. They've got all sorts of things they can do to take care of things. Making sure you have the water properly moved from your house is super important, because your basement is really terrible. So they got you covered if you're on the east side or the west side of the state. You can check them out. You get 10% off. You mentioned Final Four when you get your estimate. You can find that at the support page at the Final Fours on the schedule.com/support. And they sponsor the player that Michigan State needs to keep in the gutter. And so let's talk about the Ferris State Bulldogs. They're Ethan Erickson, 6-foot senior guard, and he led them in scoring last year, averaging almost 15 points a game. He was a good 3-point shooter. He shot 44, 44, and 90. Yeah, clearly a good shooter.
Yeah, and he was a first-team All-GLIAC guy, despite technically not being a starter. Definitely a big-time shooting threat. But just in talking about this Ferris State team in general, before we deal with the rest of their roster outside of Erickson, they've played a couple of exhibitions so far. So the first one was against alums, and they won that game. But we're not talking about guys that are in their 50s. Like, they were actually playing recent alums. And so it was competitive. I think it was like a 15-point game. And then their second exhibition game, they won by 14 over another great division or lower division Michigan school with a ton of tradition, a D3 power, Calvin.
Yep,
they beat
Grand
by
Rapids.
14.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So, yeah, as with seemingly everybody these days, Ferris has undergone a lot of roster turnover from last season, though, as opposed to Northern Michigan. If you remember, we talked about how Northern got raided.
Yeah.
They lost a lot of guys who had eligibility left to the portal. That didn't really happen with Ferris, not nearly as much. Mostly it was guys just the old-fashioned way, guys just running out of eligibility. But they've got a few guys, Erickson, the most prominent, were back from their rotation. And they've also added some newcomers that seem set to play significant roles. Stylistically, I think the thing to keep in mind is that at least offensively, they do share some commonalities with Michigan State, which I think make this an interesting matchup. They like to play fast traditionally on offense. They want to get into transition. So you would think a well-coached team will prioritize limiting Michigan State on the break. But if you like to run yourself, sometimes it can be difficult to keep that floor balance ideally where you'd want it. So that would be something to watch for if that allows Michigan State to get into transition its own self a little more frequently. The other thing that they share, the other trait they share in common with MSU, is they are also an offense that tends to record a very high percentage of assisted made field goals. So, and it's not as if you can't win other ways. There are teams who are very efficient offensively who don't have a high percentage of assisted made field goals. They're relying on guys to score one-on-one a lot, mismatch basketball. Think about a team like Illinois last year as an example of that. Not nearly as high a percentage of assisted made baskets as a Michigan State or a Ferris State, but still very efficient offensively because they were able to successfully exploit mismatches. Ferris doesn't play that way. They're a lot like Michigan State. They run their offense. They move the ball, and ball movement tends to be what leads to them having successful offense. Defensively, they do some different things. They're much more likely to want to apply pressure than Michigan State is. I kind of don't expect to see a lot of that in this game because that's usually a bad idea.
Yeah.
Unless you really got some horses defensively, and they don't have the kind of athletes you would typically expect to see from a team that might be able to give MSU problems applying pressure. But anyway, so that gives you a sense of what Ferris is, where they're at overall. It's a lot of new faces, but you're talking about a program where the standards and the style of play and all of those things are very well entrenched. And they do have enough guys back that you would hope that those players would be able to successfully transmit all of those standards to the new guys.
Yeah. All right. Well, then let's talk about Ethan Erickson. Like I mentioned, it's 6-foot senior guard, really good shooter. And as you mentioned, he's a guy who came off the bench last year.
Yeah. As we said, the first team all GLIAC choice. I think, the thing here, and it's, again, we could say, well, it's what you'd expect out of a D2 program, but frankly, most mid-majors have this kind of thing too. He's a point guard sized player who isn't really a point guard. And that's a big difference between the high major level and everything else. At their level, you can get away with having a 6-foot off guard.
Right. Because
opponents won't necessarily be any different than you are, or they might not be able to make you pay for it that much, even if they are a little different.
Mm-hmm.
At the high major level, it's tough. I mean, Michigan State's been through it the last few years with Tyson Walker, but the difference there is they had a 6'4" point guard.
Right.
In A.J. Hogarth.
Yeah, so defensively it doesn't matter. Yeah, right.
Right. You could get to a point where you didn't pay as much of a price as you might think. But at this level, it's something they won't pay for very much when they're playing their schedule, but they might pay for it in this game.
Then moving on to Reese Hazelton, 6'6", 225-pound senior forward, shot 59, 50, and 68, averaging 6.5 points a game, 3.9 rebounds a game, and just point out that his 50% three-point shooting was not much volume.
Yeah, he averaged just a touch over 1 3-point attempt a game. So not a ton of them, but he did shoot it well when he took them. And definitely a guy who's headed for a much expanded role over what he played last year. And I would expect that he will emerge as one of their better players. He just seems, I believe he was second on the team in scoring in their win over Calvin. And it just seems that, much as at Michigan State, we would be looking at a guy who, as a younger player, was a solid role contributor and role player. And as that guy matures, Jaden Akins is an example, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where he's been a support player for 3 years, and Tom Izzo has an expectation that as a senior he's going to step up. Well, I think it's similar with Ferris, and you would expect Hazelton will now be a more integral part, more of a focal point than he's been previously.
And then a name that will seem familiar to Spartan fans, Michael Bingham, a 6'8", 175-pound junior, brother of Marcus Bingham, former Spartan. He's obviously a little bit shorter. He's only 6'8". He was hurt last year, but was the year before that, he was averaging almost 7 points a game on 54, 36, and 80 shooting.
Yeah, and if you look at the physical profile, it definitely seems to run in the family that
6'8", 175.
The Binghams have trouble putting on weight, which is a problem many of us would like to have.
I was going to say, not many Americans have that problem, yeah.
But it's not as advantageous when you're trying to play college basketball. But he's been a good player for them in the past. Much like his older brother, obviously a respectable jump shooter. They think he can provide a little bit in terms of length at their level for sure. 6'8" will play a little differently than it would in the Big Ten. Much as with Hazelton, I think the expectation is that Bingham is capable of giving them a little bit more this season as he's now matured, even having sat out last year. He's a little older, hopefully a little wiser, and maybe just a little more ready to consistently impact games in a bigger way.
Then we have Tyler Hamilton, 5'11" JUCO transfer. He's originally from River Rouge. Led the team in the Calvin win with 16 points.
Yeah, and he's going to be their starting point guard. They're very high on him. He had a good JUCO season last year at St. Clair. And as you say, came out of a high school program at River Rouge that is consistently good. So he's coming from a solid background, and their expectations are that he's going to be one of their key players, no question.
And then one of the better names of the team, Deng Reng, 6'6", started 20 games last year, averaged 5.5 points and 4.4 rebounds.
Yeah, veteran, 20 starts is 20 starts. It's a nice thing to have. Not a huge scorer, but someone they think can help them on the glass, and that experience will play.
Yeah, and you will notice as we go through this, 6'6" is kind of like the average size for their team, the front line of their team here. So Kenny Turner, 6'6", 225-pound transfer from King's College, averaged 12 points a game and 7.2 rebounds a game at the other D2 school.
Yeah, and so he's a guy coming from another school at their level. So, sometimes with the D2 schools, you'll see that the transfers are coming from the portal guys are coming up from a D3 school or an NAIA school, just as we talk about if somebody's moving up from the D2 level or even the mid-major level to the Big Ten level, let's say, you wonder about how well it translates. But in this case, it's a guy coming from a peer school in terms of their levels. So I think there's a reasonable expectation that Turner will actually translate a bigger player for them, not just 6'6", but also 225. So he's bringing a little bit more strength and bulk to the team. And again, last year he averaged 7.2 rebounds. So the expectation is that at a minimum, he's going to help them in the paint as a rebounding presence and also provide some interior scoring.
Yeah. And actually, what is a little turn of surprise is Nathan Clairbot, a 7-footer, 230-pound junior. He averaged 2.5 points and 1.7 points a game, but only played about 7 minutes. So he'll be looking for expanded role and definitely unusual size for this for D2 schools.
Yeah, and over the years, Ferris has actually had some size, and I'm drawing a blank on the kid's name. They had a player a few years ago that I'd actually hoped Michigan State, when D2 transfers were less common, they had a big man who was 6'10" or 6'11" that I had hoped Michigan State might get involved with, who ended up going to Xavier and was pretty effective at that level. So they've had some legit size before. With Clairbot, it's more what you would expect. I think if you're seeing a D2 school get somebody of that size, you're likely talking about a player that really, how we talk about Big Ten schools will take flyers on big men.
Right.
Guys who haven't necessarily done great things at the high school level, but you're betting on their size and the light switching on at some point over 4 or 5 years. Try to view that through the prism of what kind of player a D2 school would be taking that kind of chance on. It's likely a guy who really hasn't done anything at lower levels, at the high school level, and you're just hoping that they eventually figure something out and are able to help you. But it is unusual, and he was in the rotation last year a little bit, 7 minutes a night. Wouldn't be surprising now that he's a year older to see his role expand a little bit more. I'm just not sure how much more production they can expect to get out of him. But certainly in a game like this one, it's nice to have that. They also have a 6'10" player who redshirted last season, who I didn't mention in our preview, but they do have 2 Big Ten sized big men on the roster, but Clairbot's the one who's actually played.
All right. So which player do you think Michigan State needs to keep in the gutter for the game?
I'm going to go with Erickson as the leading returning scorer and first team all GLIAC guy. I don't think that's getting out on a limb, although, as I mentioned, Tyler Hamilton was actually their leading scorer against Calvin, and he is the point guard. So either of them would be a good choice, but I'll go with Erickson. I mean, 44% from three is 44% from three.
The line's the same distance, right? The height of the hoop's the same. Yeah.
And so I think, that's a guy who potentially could do damage if Michigan State isn't locked in.
And this is exactly the kind of team that Izzo wants to play in an exhibition game. I mean, you're not going to, I know other teams have played D1 schools. They, like last year they played Tennessee, and so that was a really good challenge, but it's at least going to force you to be honest in your defensive switches and on defense, right? So,
sure.
So you want people who are deadly around the place so that they hit some and, learning opportunities for the team.
So for sure. I mean, you bring that up, and I was just mentioning this on the Spartan Mag board. Exhibitions obviously do not count. We know that. And it's absurdly early. And then on top of all of that, you think about how much transition most schools are going through at this point. You can't take very much from them.
Right.
But the Big Ten has really been taking it on the chin in those kind of games. You mentioned Michigan State playing Tennessee last year. MSU is not playing anybody like that this year, and that was a result of this Northern Michigan thing happening,
right?
According to Izzo. So that whole event. So, but most of the rest of the league is playing those kind of games, and it's not going well. Purdue lost to Creighton this weekend.
Oh, my.
Wisconsin lost to Northern Iowa by 10. Illinois got blasted, run out of the gym by Ole Miss. On and on and on. Michigan barely held off Toledo. That's one of the better results for the conference. So if these games are primarily for learning and early season level checks, well, they're getting that, but I hope they're learning a lot because the league is not doing very well. Michigan State, obviously, it's a different kind of opponent, but I think you're right. The thing that when you're going against a program like Ferris State, all the talking we've done about how much tradition there's been and how solid they've been year in, year out, even with roster changes, you can feel confident that you're going to be going up against a team that's well coached, that's going to be well prepared for this game, and that is capable of executing at a high enough level that it's going to force you to be on it.
Yeah.
And that's really all you want. And honestly, if I'm looking at Ferris State, and if I was comparing that to, Michigan in their first exhibition played Oakland, and Oakland has gone a complete overhaul of their roster from last year. They're nowhere near what they were last season. And Michigan, just blew them out. But honestly, if I was looking at Ferris State versus Oakland right now, Ferris State might actually be a tick better team.
Sure.
They might be.
Hard to say, yeah.
It wouldn't be surprising. And so I think you're right. This is exactly the kind of test you want to have if you're Tom Izzo. It felt to me like that, even though that Tennessee game was very competitive in the end, and it was a big-time atmosphere and all of that, to me, and this is just my view, it felt a little unnecessary.
Mm-hmm.
And I say that because we know that when Michigan State gets into November and early December, there's just going to be a rash of high-level games.
Right.
It's just one after another. And look, the bottom line is people want to win those games. Tom Izzo wants to win those games. So you coach them to win. You coach those games as if you're in February and you're worried about seeding or your resume, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And I don't know that that's always optimal. I love the scheduling philosophy, no problem with that. But in an exhibition game, I'd like some work on us time because I feel like Michigan State doesn't get a ton of that in a typical season.
Certainly not November. I mean,
no.
Because you're right, the high-profile games, you're not playing a bunch of cupcakes.
You get a couple, you might get most years, not last year, but most years, you're going to get maybe a game or two early that's of that ilk, and then you go into the Champions Classic, and then you've got whatever feast week event they're in, and then you've been, up until this year, you've been in the Big Ten ACC Challenge. that's 3 to 4 high-level games minimum.
Yep.
Not a lot of work on us time. And then, as you say, you get into December, well, you've usually got 2 Big Ten games now, and then maybe you get 2 or 3 around the holidays. It's not a lot. So I don't mind this year, at least, having this setup where, and that's not to denigrate Ferris at all. If Michigan State doesn't play well, they absolutely could lose a game like this. I don't think that'll happen, but you don't rule it out.
Sure.
You got to play well. And I think Ferris sits in that nice spot where they're going to give you enough of a test that you're not going to feel like, if we go back to that Spain trip this summer, that middle game, the second game where MSU just could have named the score against that team.
Right.
That was kind of a waste. I think that was the Barcelona game.
Yeah.
You want it to sit in a spot where the opponent's actually going to be good enough to require you to play well. And I think Ferris checks that box. At the same time, you feel like you should have an opportunity to, you mentioned at the outset, we want to get Jesse McCullough some minutes, at least a few, just to see where he's at this stage.
Yeah.
This is a game you should be able to do that.
Yeah. Yeah, you definitely, and you don't want to crush your confidence. You don't want to take on like an NBA team, right? You want to try and find a team that's, because that's also part of the team. And probably depending on what kind of team you have, the confidence issue may be bigger, more important than others,
They're going to get, what is it, game 3? They're going to play Kansas.
I heard they're pretty good.
Yeah, although they just got flat out handled by Arkansas in a scrimmage. So who knows? but yeah, it's not that far. We're 2 weeks away more or less from that kind of level check.
Yeah, right.
That's fine. Let's wait till that.
Sounds good to me.
Meantime, let's work on some things ourselves.
Yeah, I'm just in it for the ice cream sandwich. So moving on. So it's their last exhibition. So we got to pick our squeegee squad of Grand Rapids. If you need your windows cleaned, and frankly, who doesn't, right? Who's really cleaning the windows that often? So have guys get up on the ladder so you don't have to do it. The squeegee squad of Grand Rapids, they can do fantastic work, well priced. They can power wash your house, whatever you need done, all that nasty stuff in the fall that you don't want to do, they will do, get up and do. So reach out to them. They're in the Grand Rapids, and it's a pretty big Grand Rapids-ish region. You can get all the way out to even Lansing, I suppose. They're so good. They're experts. They even clean the Capitol. So you can contact them at our support page, and you get 15% off. You mentioned Final Four when you get your estimate at the Squeegee Squad of Grand Rapids. Again, that can be found at tffinots.com/support. And they sponsor the Clean the Glass segment here. So who for Michigan State? Now, this is exhibition. This doesn't count. I don't even remember who went first last time, so I'll let you go first.
I went first. You can go.
Okay, I'll go first. All right. So, but this is, again, not going to count. So I think I'll just go with, I'll follow recent history. So I'll just go with Sapala, since he seems to be, we'll get a feel for it, like you said before, probably after a couple of weeks. But for right now, we'll just go with him.
I think for now, that's the right choice. It's the one I would have made as well. So then it probably comes down to, I tried to go off the board.
Yeah, you were
last time.
Yeah, you want to try and go on the boards, right? This is you want to get
I went
rebounds,
with Frankie Fiddler.
Yeah.
And foul trouble doomed me on that front. So to me, it really comes down to Cooper, Kohler, and Booker. I'm not ready to think that Book's going to do it. I'm going to go with Coop.
Okay.
I'm going to go with Carson Cooper.
All right. So then let's look at the keys to the game, things to watch, brought to you by Nudge Printing, our long sponsor, Michigan-based in Portland, Michigan, by some great Spartans, Gabe and Brittany. You can find all their stuff, a huge selection of apparel, Michigan State stuff at Nudge Printing at nudgeprinting.com. They great delivery, great pricing, and super comfortable clothing. It's my family's favorite. I can't recommend it enough. If you need, whether you need basketball stuff, hockey stuff, just general Michigan State stuff to go around the house or to go out to eat or whatever it is, they absolutely should be your first stop. Again, at nudgeprinting.com. If you're looking for other stuff too, even if you're looking for Central Michigan stuff, which now it's amazing. I never used to have any opinion of Central Michigan. The Fire Up chips. Now I really just don't like them. You can even find their stuff there along with the other schools in Michigan outside of the University of Michigan. You can Find that again, nudgeprinting.com, 20% off. You type in Final Four just as one word at checkout. And he also has some cool custom hats he wants you to check out too. So check those out. All right. So 5 things, keys to the game. Number 1, the most obvious, health.
Yeah, you don't really even
not much more to say
much more about it. Yeah, it's the same as with every one of these games, and it's actually going to be true the first couple games of the regular season.
Yeah, absolutely.
When you're playing these kind of games that you expect to win, the first thing on the checklist is, hey, let's not get anybody hurt. It's kind of like the Lions game today, right?
Yeah, right.
With all the people screaming, and I was there too.
Yeah.
Midway through the third quarter, you're up 28 points. Get Goff out.
Yeah.
Get Goff out. They didn't do it quite quickly enough for my taste, but it looks like they got through it. A little bit of an ankle scare, but looks like he's okay.
Well, speaking of the Lions, the number 2 key to the game is Super Bowl.
Right. Yeah, and look, this is what I mean by that. So we've talked about quite a bit already. Ferris has incredible tradition, particularly under Bronkema. So their guys, the guys who are back, are used to success and winning. And the guys that have joined the program, in part, you would think came there because they want to succeed and they want to be someplace where they can win.
Right.
I say that to say, Ferris State has, I'm certainly not of the opinion that there's a cockiness or anything like that, but you could say that they're used to winning.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not as if this is, the Little Sisters of the Poor, the Washington Generals, trying to rise up by any means. But all that said, an opportunity to play against Michigan State, I have to believe, is one that their players absolutely relish for a couple of reasons. The obvious one is you're a D2 player. You get a crack at not just a D1 program, but one of the all-time great D1 programs. Man, you want to use that opportunity to make your mark. Say, boy, you guys missed the boat when you didn't recruit me.
Right.
But the bigger thing, in my view, is they've got, and I have not delved into the D2 rules, but apparently you must not have restrictions on roster size.
Nope.
I know they've got restrictions on scholarship numbers, but you can have more walk-ons than you can at Michigan State's level. They've got 20 players listed on their roster.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay. Between scholarship guys and walk-ons. 17 of them are from Michigan. The vast majority of those are from the west side of the state. I mean, their roster is just littered with guys from Grand Rapids and Muskegon, all those areas over there. So I think it's safe to assume that the motivation level on their side is going to be very, very high in this game. In that way, it's no different than the challenge MSU faces annually when they face Oakland, or in the odd years where they play a U of D or a Western or an Eastern, So that's what I mean by this. Ferris State, I'm sure, has very, very strong and realistic goals to be an NCAA tournament team, to win their league. All of those things would seem to be reasonable for them to have in play, because it's what they tend to do almost every year. But this is another level. And so to say, it's a Super Bowl kind of opportunity for them, I don't think that's crazy. And that's an additional level of motivation that MSU's got to deal with.
Yeah. Well, it's very interesting. These private schools, that one of the strategies now is to add football teams and other athletics, because you can, like you mentioned, you can have unlimited size rosters. And so a lot of these schools, is one of the ways they get more kids to go to their school and to.
It's a good point.
Is that now, obviously you're not going to be able to have, 100 people on your football team, but it's not unusual to have some of these teams, like 150 kids are on their football teams. And I mean, 20 on a basketball team is, obviously you only play 5 at a time. So that's right. Far more than you need.
But it probably makes for a very good situation in terms of their practice.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Yeah. If you have injuries, you don't have to worry about that as much either. And probably get, guys playing decent ball. All right. So number 3 key to the game is transition. And anybody who watched the Northern Michigan game, I know we talked about it on the show, there was, maybe there was a transition bucket. Maybe like 2 the entire game. So there's almost non-existent.
Yeah, it was really unfortunate because that was something that I was generally pretty pleased with over the Spanish trip, and it just didn't show up against Northern. So you want to see improvement overall in this area, and particularly for me, I want to see it from Jeremy Fears, which is weird to say because during the brief introduction he got to Michigan State basketball last fall,
Mm-hmm.
and what we saw from him in Spain, I was really, really impressed in general with the way he looked to push tempo consistently. But I didn't see that from him in the same way against Northern. I thought that Trey in particular at least tried. He wasn't able to actually get any or much generated in terms of run out opportunities, but at least he was trying to push tempo, was getting the ball into the forecourt quickly. I thought Jeremy was a little bit lacking there. So focusing on him, I want to see improvement there. As I mentioned earlier, Ferris generally, the way they play, they want to play up-tempo basketball themselves. So even though they're a very, very well-coached team, maybe, and this is a guess more than an expectation, but maybe there will be a few more opportunities for Michigan State going the other way. And if there are, they got to take advantage of it. But even if they're not getting on the break so much, I just want to see Jeremy be more himself, more aggressive in terms of getting the ball into the forecourt, getting into the offense quickly. And that's kind of the minimum I want to see.
Yeah, we want to see the old Jeremy, which, like you said, not a whole lot of experience, but from previous experience. But the one we saw when he was playing early in the last year. All right, so the fourth key to the game is offensive boards. I mean, we talk about this all the time. Obviously, rebounding for Michigan State, not a strength of theirs last year. They had 33% or 32% or something like that at the Northern Michigan game. So, okay, but especially against Northern Michigan, you expect to dominate a little bit more than that.
It was 31%, which is barely, generally speaking, 30% is your bottom end of an acceptable range. If you're below 30%, you had a bad offensive rebound.
Mm-hmm.
If you're at 30%, which Michigan State basically was, you had a mediocre night. And if you get into the high 30s, you were pretty good or better. As you say, Northern, not a huge team, so you would hope to be better there than they were. Now, I took note of something Tom Izzo said this week during his post-practice media scrums that he likes to do, where you see the footage of him underneath one of the baskets at Breslin.
Yes.
And he's surrounded by the reporters. He talked about MSU looking to steal possessions. That was how he characterized it. And if you listen to what he meant by that, he was talking about a theme that we discuss essentially with regard to every single game. Because what it means is, are you getting more opportunities to score than your opponent? It's just that simple.
Right.
So the way you measure that is primarily in two main areas: rebounding and turnovers. If you have an advantage in the turnover department, well, you've gotten more shots up than your opponent. Same thing applies to rebounding. If you're posting more offensive rebounds than your opponent, you are getting additional chances to score vis-a-vis what they are,
Yeah.
And so it's this holistic concept that, again, includes how well you value the ball also and how many takeaways you generate. But I think in particular when it comes to offensive rebounding, everybody listening to this, I'm positive, knows that offensive rebounding, if you could point to one phase of the game and say, this is what Michigan State basketball under Tom Izzo was built on. What was the one core value, the one thing above all others that identified what Michigan State is as a program? I think it would be offensive rebounding.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree.
Some might argue for defense, but I think it would be offensive rebounding. And the fact of the matter is, we've really, since that Tillman Winston group left, we've seen about 4 years now where Michigan State's offensive rebounding has not come close to being at the Michigan State standard. And you can variety of reasons to explain that. I think mostly personnel based, but as we talked about, there've also been some instances where it felt to me like probably because of the personnel that Michigan State strategically was not approaching it the way they traditionally had.
Right.
Remember we had that discussion with Mike Garland where
he tried to convince us that they did.
I feel like Coach was he was running a game on us. I mean, like, wait a minute, I'm looking on my screen, I don't see anybody in green and white in the picture when a shot goes up. Is that Michigan State or is that Bo Ryan's Wisconsin? I don't know. But I have to believe that at least for now, Tom Izzo wants to get back to having an advantage in that area. And so this would be a game I'd like to see Michigan State kind of impose its will a little bit. You're playing an opponent that's mostly smaller than you, and I think in terms of the guys who are going to play the majority of the minutes, that's definitely true. Bronkema talked about that in the video I watched, where he's talking about what a great challenge it is for his guys, where, everybody he was exaggerating slightly, but he's like, everybody's 6'8", 240 at athletic. Talking about Michigan State's roster. Right, yeah. But the general point is obviously correct that he's making. So I'd like to see Michigan State translate that into production in this area and start establishing a commitment to doing damage on the offensive glass as a habit again.
Yeah, and we've mentioned before, but of course, the other advantage to offensive rebounding, you either are taking a shot close to the hoop, and usually the defense is not yet rotated around to you, or you can kick it out to shooters, and usually just much like a transition, like in the secondary break, the defense is not set, so you get better shots oftentimes off those offensive rebounds. Right?
100%. Case in point, one of the, they didn't have a ton. I think they had eight or nine. I think it was 9 offensive rebounds in the game. But I vividly remember at least one of them, Kurt Tang chasing an offensive rebound down, kicking to Jeremy Fears for a 3.
Yep.
You're absolutely right. It's a cliche, but it's a cliche because it's got a lot of truth to it. You will hear people often say there's rarely a better 3-point look available than the one that comes via an offensive rebound and a kick out. And that's true for the reason you just suggested. A defense is scrambling. They're usually not going to be able to close well enough to get a good contest, and you get an easy opportunity. So, it's something you want to see Michigan State take advantage of, for sure.
And the fifth and final key to the game is poise. So, Michigan State last year was fantastic in hanging on to the ball, not turning it over. 14 turnovers against Northern Michigan. So, again, not disaster, but not great. So, we'll see what they do
I never felt like they were way out of control.
Yeah, there were a lot of charges. I think that a couple of those were just offensive fouls.
The two on Fiddler were terrible calls. You're right. And just take those off the board and you all of a sudden are feeling a lot better about it. But I would say it also wasn't a game where you could say, well, look, Michigan State was going up and down the floor. It was a 94-foot game a lot of the time. So when you're doing that, you're going to have mistakes. I'll give you an example. Michigan right now under Dusty May. Dusty May gets compared a lot with John Beilein, and he does share certain things in common with Beilein in a general sense in terms of an emphasis on offense. But one thing they don't share is tempo. And if you remember, John Beilein's teams played very, 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 very slowly, but they were also always perpetually among the best teams in the country at minimizing turnovers. A lot of times, not just in the Big Ten, but nationally, it would be Bo Ryan's teams at Wisconsin and John Beilein's teams at Michigan kind of duking it out for who would have the best turnover rate in the country, meaning lowest percentage of turnovers per possession. Dusty May in these 2 exhibition games, they've been hemorrhaging turnovers because he wants to play fast, but he doesn't seem to be that upset about it. And I wouldn't be either because that's how he wants to play. Mm-hmm. And much as has historically been the case with Tom Izzo, if you're going to play true up-tempo basketball, you pretty much have to accept that you're going to have a few more mistakes than others might. I mean, the one exception I can think of in that regard is somehow Fran McCaffrey always gets his Iowa teams to play fast basketball and yet not turn the ball over. But that's a rarity.
Yeah, and I don't think they play a break though. You know, like they just take it over the timeline quickly, and that's kind of like.
And that's what I was going to say. Yeah. You're exactly right. It's a little bit of a different approach. Yes, they play a fast tempo, but they're not really a 94-foot team. They don't usually have the athletes to do that the way a Michigan State typically does. So all that is to say this. If this Michigan State team is playing the way I think everybody from Tom Izzo on down wants them to play, they're going to be faster than they were last year. And in transition more consistently than they were last year. And so along with that, you can say, okay, I don't expect to have the turnover rate that last year's team had, which was pretty easily the best of the Tom Izzo era. It was the one thing you could say about last year's team that was absolutely a success is the way they valued the ball. But that said, that's not an excuse for this team. You don't want to see them getting into the bad old days where it's like, oh, you know, in November, we're seeing 18, 19 turnovers a game.
Right, yeah.
So, and I say this also because, again, we know that Ferris, at least at their level of play in D2, they want to run. So there's a chance this is a faster-paced game. And so you just don't want to see Michigan State get totally loose with the ball.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, we'll leave it there, and we'll be back after the game for the post-game analysis. So until next time, the Final Four is on the schedule. Go Green.